Life. Through the early autumn mist, giant tors, invisible at 20 paces, emerged from cloud as looming silhouettes of stone. The traveller headed north. Soon the time would come to open the school, to do for others what had been done for him. His time of preparation, of watching, was over. He spent the night on the edge of a forest, a broad tapestry of uncharted groves and mazes. The forest was his, and yet only once had he set foot inside, to wander through its glades and hear their sounds, to take in the fragrance of fresh new leaves and decomposing wood. He looked out over the bordering countryside and considered the hills and fields, the small remaining patches of woodland, the animals and the birds. A feeling of release filled him. Centuries he had spent on his mother's lap, surrounded by brothers and sisters, but then had entered the world, and for 140 years had travelled. It was easy for the traveller to see the difficulties man faced in a world rife with conflict. Man could not expect to lose the protective instincts that evolved with him over millions of years, but man had evolved, and counteracting his coldness was warmth and kindness, his loyalty to friends and family. Through all the ugliness the traveller had encountered, through the lying and cheating, the abuse and violence perpetrated with the constancy of ocean waves, the traveller could not overlook the kindness. The sound of banter, songs and stories beside fires filled his ears. The affection shown in pairs, the care of parents for children. He thought also of men and their animals. He thought of the tending of gardens, the relief found in the colour and delicacy of a flower. He thought of the care men took over their crafts, their carving of wood, their forming of glass and sculpting of clay. These kindnesses arose from the goodness in man, but they did not dominate those in whom they lived. The traveller had seen how each man, each woman, and each child offered both kindness and meanness. Their moods shifted as if with the passing shade of clouds. Each person was a mixture of strength and weakness, and as the agent of his father, the traveller was tasked to weigh those, to see in each which held the power. He was to learn how man thought and felt. Comprehending man's predicament would allow him to solve the problem he faced. He had tried to feel man's world, to see men as men see each other, to find within himself the world that man expects to find in his peers. But to do this, the traveller would have to hide. He would have to pretend, through his silence, to belong. He was convinced he had failed. He had received a taste of man's pain, disappointments, resilience and love, but what he felt more acutely was the conflict of his own position. Out of fairness to man, he had sought to be more than just an image, but however hard he tried, he could never be anything other than himself. So how could he know what it was to be man, to choose on that basis? He had not found the answer that he sought. His experience had only complicated that task. The old man had given him a simple problem: choose amongst men. But how? Man's suffering had softened him. He questioned now what action of man could not be forgiven. As Kieran had said, man could not help how he acted. He was formed long before he could learn to choose, and his choices would ever be guided by his past. That is why Alfred was able to choose to leave the very world that Kieran had so desired. His formation was different, and so his choices were different. The traveller felt that his choices should be based on the choices men had made. It was their choices, after all, that determined where they stood and how they evolved. But this method could not work. A man, choosing well from a low position, could still be far meaner than one who, from a position of strength, had chosen badly. The traveller could seek to determine the trajectory of each man. He could consider a certain period of time and see if that mean person continued to choose well, such that he would surpass those strong who had continued to choose badly. But this would be too complex, too ambiguous, too uncertain in the variables he would have to take into account. The traveller could comprehend men both as individuals and in groups, and yet the consideration of the navigation of influences by each individual man was overwhelming. And, in addition, even if the traveller chose this path, it would not solve the problem of the inevitably arbitrary nature of the period of time chosen in which to judge. This unresolved tension continued to grasp at the traveller's mind. The answer, he realized, could not come from man or from man's ways. His consideration of the value of individual men from their own point of view had led him in a circle. Man's application of justice was flawed because men themselves were faced with the difficulty of finding a measure to apply. the measures men used differed in substance among societies, each approach colored by local sentiments and traditions, but each also differed in application, affected as they were by power and influence. In the traveler's view, the best measures from the human standpoint were consistent in being imprecise and flexible. They took into account specific conditions and circumstances, and rightly so, for man had no better way of judging, and his humanity required he judged sometimes with strictness and sometimes with leniency. But this was far too chaotic a measure for the traveller to achieve his task. Man's path led where it did because his laws were susceptible to his weakness. Unavoidably, they were designed to retain the power the designers held. That was the line always inevitably drawn. It was not that there were no laws to protect the innocent from the corrupt, but generally those laws were only allowed to the extent they did not interfere beyond a certain point. They would be allowed so long as they allowed the retention of control by the powerful in the name of stability. Influence ruled the judging of men by men. Because of the balance of power within any given man, and among men in general, no man could have confidence in his ability to truly correct what faults he saw. No matter how clear a view of justice man might gain, he could only ever apply it to the extent of what could possibly be allowed. The traveller saw clearly that his measure would have to be more certain than the fleeting inclinations of man, and more definite than the limiting vested interests of man would allow. His measure would have to be of a general nature, not of a local nature. His measure would also involve vested interests, but they would not be those of man who measured value in terms of wealth. The vested interests would have to be those of mankind's ultimate benefit. They would have to be those of the diversity and wealth of nature, of beauty, of true humanity. It was clear to the traveller every man had his own idea of humanity, and of what constituted benefit to him or to mankind as a whole. These could not be the traveller's measure, nor even his guidelines. Man had shown that his idea of what constituted benefit was hopelessly lost in base, immediate considerations. It was steeped in corrupted notions, commandeered to serve the continuing greed of those whose ambition had driven them ever to procure whatever power was available to gain. The traveller had an advantage over man. He was not a man. He had no interest other than to serve his father. Because of his lack of interest, the traveller could see man's humanity better than man could. He could see the good in man and the broken. He could see where man went astray, where man failed in achieving his true potential. To see man's potential was beyond man as a whole, but it was not beyond men as individuals or even as small groups. Individual men who had distilled so as to comprehend their individual failings had caught clear glimpses of man's possibilities. It was in large groups that the wisdom of the few was lost, for there the complexities of the individual mind's failings were compounded. Clarity, to the extent man had known it, was sacrificed amidst the compromise of many. The common good became the common comfort, and this meant entreating those who would always ask for more. Thus the meek continued to serve the bold, but clarity and justice were not matters on which to compromise. For the traveller they were absolutes. By contrast, men each saw clarity and justice in their own way and to their own extent, and so clarity and justice became confused and debated. It was not difficult for the traveller to see what man missed. It was before him now, in the fields and in the woods. It was in the birds that flew above, calling to one another with song. It was in the steady grazing of cows and sheep. It was in the dew and the spider's web to which the dew clung. It was in the patience of his dog, the strength and sensitivity of his horse. It was in the wind and in the sound of the stream. It was in these that man's heart lay, where his soul could be found. And where man had set his intellect to consider these, he could not help but find humility. It was by observing and interacting with nature that man's intellect had grown. But what knowledge man had gained he attended to destroy. He saw nature as mere material, to be degraded into empty constructions of thought. He developed and clung to ideas based in the worst of his ignorance, and these poisoned his mind with incoherence. Only recently had man rediscovered the use of his mind, but the traveller saw that man's sordid history with the irrational would undermine all of the knowledge he was destined to comprehend. The mystical would be associated with the irrational. New knowledge would grow without guidance, and would prove even more destructive than the absurdity. This was not what had been intended for man. The traveller lay back on the grass. Night had fallen, and the stars above twinkled like frost in moonlight across the sky. The answer he sought eluded him, but he had learned why man was not able to solve his problems alone. He had also learned that he could not accomplish his task by applying a version of man's perspective. He was confident, though, that understanding man, empathizing with his strengths and weaknesses to the extent he could, would prove vital to the choices he, eventually, would be required to make.